In this lecture, we're going to look at the road to Israel's formation. Also, another thing we're going to do is look at the formation not just from the perspective of immigrants, Jewish immigrants to Ottoman Syria, but also from the Arab settlers who are also there. Sometimes narratives of the formation of Israel just completely ignore the Arab residents as if they aren't a factor in the equation, and they're only acknowledged when they rise up in revolt against Jews. And so I want to make sure to look at both sides of this issue, because a lot of the tensions and a lot of the animosities between Israelis and Palestinians today really come out of this period. And it's a large question of who owns the land, who has the proper historical claim to the land. Amongst Jewish immigrants, particularly from this period, would argue that, well, we're the ancient nation of Israel, and we were promised it by God thousands of years ago. Whereas Palestinians would argue that they had been cultivating and farming and inhabiting this land for centuries and were acknowledged by the Ottoman Empire and other governments, so they're the ones who have proper claim to the land. But beyond just esoteric arguments, the way that certain groups are displaced from the land leads to them joining militias and fuels a lot of this conflict that happens in the years immediate to Israel's proclamation as a nation. Israel became a state primarily due to British support for a Jewish homeland. The British tried to mediate peace between Jews and Muslims, but ultimately failed. After we go through this lesson, you'll understand the history of Israel's relationship with the West, and while many Middle Easterners think Western support for Israel comes at their own expense. Let's take a look at the British Mandate first of all. Following the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in 1918 in the Middle East, the advent of British control over Palestine marked the first time since the Crusades in 1191 that a non-Muslim power controlled Jerusalem. As they administered it for the next 3 decades, many British politicians noticed the immigration of Jews to Palestine and looked favorably on the Zionist movement. This wasn't really due to altruism, but part of the great game of imperial conflict, mostly between Britain and Russia, particularly in Central Asia. Britain thought that if they had a population sympathetic to them farther out in the east, this could benefit them. So this is part of the reason that you see strong British support for a Jewish homeland. Britain supported the creation of a Jewish homeland, but with an important caveat. They did not want to compromise the moral and material well-being of the Muslim inhabitants there. But how were supposed to do these two things together was anyone's guess, and largely it's been anyone's guess for the last 9 decades. Another thing I want to mention here, going back a few decades, are important reforms that happen that cause the Arab residents of Palestine to be dislodged. I mentioned in the previous lecture that there were waves of Jewish immigrants who came to this area, created farm settlements, and started to engage in agriculture. Okay, but where did they get this land? Where did this come from? This goes to the Ottoman Land Code of 1858, which for the first time required land titles. And this reformed the previous practice of hereditarily passing down land from father to son, or common law ideas of land tenure. If you farm the land, then over time it became yours. Now you had to have a land title. How this worked out was that upper classes could now register the land as theirs, completely bypassing the people who actually farmed the land, and they sold it to Jewish settlers who were arriving in waves. So what happened from the perspective of a farmer is that their absentee landlord was selling it to a Jewish settler without their involvement whatsoever. A prospective buyer and the owner weren't in engagement, but instead it was these outside entities. The land was purchased, and Arab cultivators were displaced by foreigners with political objectives, not negotiated between prospective owners and inhabitants. This becomes very important because, as one could very easily imagine, this would lead to resentment if one had a family farm for generations was now suddenly displaced. Many of these people who are displaced from their farms joined riots against the newly arrived Jews to Palestine. You see this in the Jaffa riots in 1929, the Hebron massacre of 1929, and they have to do with Palestinians displaced or landless due to settlers of their land, the settling of their land by landowners. Many of these people who were displaced joined militant organizations. So I wanted to mention that from the very beginning of the arrival of these Jewish migrants, there's already a conflict brewing between land ownership, and many have argued that the means by which this land is procured happened under dubious premises. So there's a lot of conflict already happening here, with both sides having a very different take on how the land is initially procured, and the question of who owns the land is a central issue that just keeps coming up for the next few decades. Now let's look at the Balfour Declaration. This is the major piece of legislation that frames these issues. The backbone of British diplomatic support for a Jewish state was in the 1917 Balfour Declaration. Here, British Foreign Secretary Lord Balfour declared to Britain's Jewish community his government support for the creation of a Jewish national homeland in Palestine. In 1920, Britain created and administered a state which was carved out of Ottoman Syria, part of which consisted of Palestine, or modern-day Israel. It was known as the British Mandate for Palestine, and the League of Nations consented that Britain could oversee the area until it could function as a self-sustaining nation. Okay, well, problems immediately arise. I talked before about Arabs who were displaced from the land which they had farmed for generations. So they were unhappy with these developments, of course, and additionally they felt betrayed that the British had not given them an independent homeland, as the British High Commissioner in Egypt had promised them in 1915. As a result, the Arab leadership refused to participate in any institution that included Jewish leadership, making the development of a Jewish Arab Palestinian state enormously difficult. After all, they thought that if they participated with the British, who had already betrayed them once, it could very easily happen again, and they could fall into a further marginalized state. As a result, the Arab leadership refused to participate. Tensions within Arab communities continued to rise with the tide of Jewish immigrants arriving from Europe and Russia. Coupled with a sense that they were losing control of their homeland, this tension reached a boiling point in 1920 and 1921, with Arab riots breaking out in response to evictions caused by these Jewish purchases of land that had been going on for decades by now, starting in 1880, but with larger numbers of them arriving to Palestine with these successive waves and these successive aliyahs. The number of evictions increases, tension increases, leading to these revolts. Furthermore, the waves of Jewish migration is just exacerbated by events happening in Europe. When Hitler took power in 1933, Jews flooded into Palestine. The demographic upset and the British killing of Palestinian militia leader Sheikh Izz al-Din al-Qassam, for whom a certain type of rocket is named after, used by Palestinians, led to the Arab revolts of 1936 to 1939. The British supported Jewish auxiliaries, and it was ultimately successful. In total, 5,000 Arabs died, another 10,000 were injured, but only 400 Jews died. Well, of course, this didn't solve the conflict, and it barely staunched the bleeding. You could argue that it only made it worse. Following this conflict, the British became convinced that Jews and Arabs couldn't coexist and that partition of this land was necessary. But first, the British decided to stymie the effects of further Jewish immigration in order to create some type of equilibrium, and seeing that this massive immigration was just continuing to cause social unrest, they tried to stop this. So what they did was, in 1939, they limited the number of Jewish arrivals to a quota of 15,000 annually for the next 5 years. Well, what's happening at this time is, of course, the Holocaust. Due to this, far more than this attempted to enter Palestine per annum. The British placed those that exceeded the 15,000 quota into detention camps, an action that created a permanent rift between the British and Jewish leadership. Following World War II, 250,000 Jews were in displaced persons camps in Europe, hoping to enter Israel, but Britain refused to alter the quota. This refusal resulted in a series of violent attacks against the British presence in Palestine in the early 1940s, carried out by Jewish militants. Faced with the death of hundreds of their own people, the British decided to suspend the emigration mandate and withdraw completely from Palestine in May 1948, essentially wiping their hands clean of the whole affair. In 1947, the United Nations voted to partition the land of Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states and make Jerusalem an international zone. Jews enthusiastically accepted the resolution, while Arabs, of course, rejected it. While the international community, unable and unwilling to stop the conflict between Jews and Arabs of Palestine, the stage was now set for war. The only way this could be really resolved was through a military conflict. This is where we're going to see the birth of the nation of Israel in the next lecture, which many people hoped would resolve the issue of landless Palestinians and this whole argument over who has proper claim to the land. Well, there's a status quo that's reached, but few would argue that it resolved the problem, which we're going to see in the next lecture.